Tonight, you are not at home, and you are not quite awake either. You find yourself seated beside the window of a quiet Victorian night train, gently rolling through the English countryside. The carriage is warm, softly lit by golden lamps that sway ever so slightly with the motion of the rails. Outside, the world drifts by in darkness. Occasional lanterns glowing faintly in distant fields. A lonely station passing without a sound. There is nowhere you need to be. Nothing expected of you tonight. Only the steady rhythm of the train, and the quiet comfort of simply being carried forward. So, allow your body to settle, and let the journey begin.
The station breathed softly beneath its glass roof. Gas lamps stood in patient rows, each one holding a small, steady flame that trembled only when a draft passed through the iron beams above. The air carried coal smoke, damp wool, and the faint mineral scent of rain that had already fallen earlier in the evening. The train waited without urgency. Its black engine rested at the head of the platform like a creature that had traveled this route so many times it no longer felt the need to announce itself. Steam escaped in slow sighs, drifting upward and dissolving before it reached the rafters. In the third carriage from the rear sat Edmund Hale. He had taken the window seat, not because he intended to look out for long, but because habit preferred it. His coat was neatly buttoned, his hat placed beside him on the empty cushion, and his gloves folded with care, as though order itself were a form of rest. Edmund was not traveling for business, nor was he returning home. This journey existed in a quieter category, one that required no explanation even to himself. It was simply a night train moving northward through the English countryside, and he was allowing himself to be carried by it. A bell rang once at the far end of the platform. Not sharply, but politely. Doors closed with muted thuds. Somewhere, a porter's footsteps echoed and then faded. The lamps along the platform seemed to lean closer, as if wishing the train a safe passage. When the engine finally stirred, it did so gently. The first movement was almost unnoticeable, a subtle easing forward, followed by the familiar rhythm settling into place. Tack-dum, tack-dum. The sound traveled along the carriages, through the wooden frames, into the seats, and finally into Edmund's chest, where it slowed his breathing without asking permission. Outside the window, the platform slid away. Faces became shapes. Shapes became shadows. Shadows dissolved into the dark. The train had left. Inside the carriage, the gas lamps were turned low. Their light spread in a soft amber glow, touching polished brass fittings and the smooth grain of the wooden walls. The carriage was sparsely occupied. A woman several rows ahead leaned her head against the glass, already surrendered to sleep. Farther back, someone shifted once, then grew still. Edmund rested his hands upon his lap. He did not close his eyes. There was no need. The countryside announced itself gradually. First came the absence of buildings. Then the wider stretches of darkness between occasional hedgerows. From time to time, a single house appeared, its windows glowing briefly before slipping away behind the train. Each light lasted only a moment, long enough to be noticed, not long enough to demand thought. The rails continued their steady conversation beneath the carriage, unbroken and unhurried. The train neither raced nor lingered. It moved at a pace that suggested it knew exactly how long the night was meant to be. Edmund's thoughts loosened. They did not disappear. They simply slowed, spacing themselves farther apart, like fence posts passing by in the dark. The train entered open land. The scent of wet earth drifted faintly through the carriage, carried in by some small opening that no one ever quite found. It mixed with the warmth of the lamps and the lingering smoke, creating a smell that belonged only to night journeys. Edmund allowed his shoulders to drop. Nothing was required of him now. The train would handle the distance. The night would handle the time. And he, for the moment, would simply remain where he was, seated, supported, and quietly moving forward. The train settled into its true pace. There was always a moment, shortly after departure, when a night journey decided what kind of night it would be. This was that moment. The engine no longer adjusted itself. The carriages no longer creaked in conversation. Everything that needed to be done had already been done. The darkness beyond the windows deepened. Not suddenly, but with patience. Fields stretched out unseen, their boundaries suggested only by the occasional line of hedgerow slipping past. Trees appeared as darker shapes against an already dark sky, their branches still, as though they, too, were listening. Edmund remained in his seat. His reflection faintly surfaced in the glass. Not sharp, not detailed, but present enough to remind him that he was there. The reflection moved only when the lamps flickered or when the train gently swayed along a curve in the track. The rhythm of the rails continued. It did not change. Tack, dum, tack, dum. The sound arrived evenly, predictably, creating a space between each beat where nothing else needed to exist. Edmund noticed that his breathing had begun to follow it without effort, as though the body recognized something familiar in the pattern. A guard passed through the carriage. His steps were unhurried. The soft click of his boots against the floor came and went, accompanied by the quiet rustle of fabric and the faint metallic sound of keys at his belt. He paused briefly near the end of the carriage, glanced around with a practiced calm, and moved on. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. The lamps remained low, their light steady and warm. Shadows rested comfortably in the corners of the carriage, undisturbed. Even the windows seemed less reflective now, offering more darkness than image. Outside, the land dipped and rose. Somewhere beyond the reach of sight, a stream followed its own course, unseen but persistent. Farther still, livestock slept where they had settled for the night, unaware of the train passing through the edges of their fields. Edmund's thoughts wandered briefly, not forward, not back, but sideways. They brushed against memories without stopping, like fingers trailing through tall grass. Nothing demanded attention. The carriage swayed, not enough to disturb, only enough to remind its occupants that movement was continuing. The seats absorbed the motion, the wooden fabric shaped by years of similar journeys. Time loosened. Minutes no longer announced themselves. The night stretched gently, unmarked, allowing moments to drift into one another without edges. Edmund shifted slightly, adjusting the weight of his coat across his knees. The fabric was warm. The air was neither cold nor hot, but carefully balanced, as though arranged for sleep rather than travel. Beyond the window, a distant light appeared. It was not a station, just a solitary lamp near a crossing, standing watch over empty ground. It glowed briefly, then slipped behind the carriage, leaving the darkness complete once more. Edmund did not follow it with his eyes. He remained where he was, carried forward by the rails, surrounded by the steady presence of the train, and held within a stretch of night that asked nothing of him at all. The train slowed without fully stopping. This was how it passed certain places, with courtesy rather than arrival. The change in motion was subtle, felt more in the body than seen through the window. The rhythm of the rails softened, stretching the space between each beat. A platform emerged from the dark. It was narrow and lightly kept, its edges pale beneath a single row of lamps. No crowd waited there, no voices rose. The station existed in the same way a thought sometimes does just before sleep, present, but not insistent. Edmund observed without engagement. The station sign slipped by too slowly to be read clearly, its lettering blurred by age and night. A bench sat beneath the lamps, empty and patient. Somewhere beyond the platform, a small building rested with its windows dark. The train did not stop. It continued forward, granting the station only a moment of acknowledgement before reclaiming its steady pace. Inside the carriage, nothing changed. The lamps remained low. The air remained still. The few passengers who had been awake continued in their quiet states, neither disturbed nor drawn toward the window. Another station followed. This one revealed itself only through light. A brief glow passing across the carriage walls, then fading. Its platform was shorter, its presence lighter, as though it had been built to be passed rather than visited. Edmund felt a mild curiosity, thin and gentle. He wondered, without effort, who might use these stations during the day. Who might arrive in the morning with parcels or letters? And who might depart in the late afternoon with nothing more than time to spend? The thought dissolved before forming a conclusion. The train moved on. Beyond the glass, signals blinked once and were gone. A semaphore arm rested in its night position, confident that it would be seen by those who needed to see it. The rails resumed their familiar cadence. Tack, dum, tack, dum. Edmund's breathing aligned once more, slower now, deeper, as though the body had learned that nothing ahead required preparation. A faint vibration traveled through the floor as the train crossed a set of points, then smoothed itself out again. The carriage responded with a soft creak, a sound shaped by age and repetition. Time continued to soften. The stations, unvisited and unannounced, slipped into memory almost as soon as they passed. They left no weight behind them. Outside, the countryside returned to its uninterrupted darkness. Inside, the night journey resumed its quiet agreement with those it carried, to move forward without haste, to acknowledge without interruption, and to pass through places that remained gently asleep. The corridor breathed differently from the carriage. It was narrower, quieter in its own way, carrying the soft language of movement, fabric brushing wood, a distant footstep, the subtle sway that followed each bend in the line. Edmund became aware of it without turning his head. A presence passed beyond his seat. Not hurried, not hesitant. Just a figure moving with the familiarity of someone who had walked this length many times before. The sound was gentle enough to blend with the rhythm of the train. Noticeable only because it briefly altered the silence. A man paused near the door at the end of the carriage. He rested one hand on the brass handle, steadying himself as the train leaned into a curve. His coat was dark and well worn, its shape softened by years of similar nights. He looked neither young nor old, merely accustomed. The guard did not speak. He glanced along the rows of seats with a calm, unmeasuring look, the sort that counted nothing and judged nothing. Satisfied, he continued on, his steps fading into the corridor beyond. Edmund remained still. The brief interruption did not disturb the quiet, it deepened it. The carriage seemed to settle further into itself once the movement passed, as though grateful to return to stillness. Somewhere farther along the train, a door opened and closed. The sound was muted, padded by distance and upholstery. A murmur followed, not words, but the suggestion of them, and then silence reclaimed its place. Another passenger shifted nearby. A man 2 rows back adjusted his position, exhaled once, and did not move again. His presence was known only by that single sound, after which he became part of the carriage rather than a person within it. Edmund's gaze rested unfocused upon the window. Darkness pressed gently against the glass, interrupted only by the occasional reflection of a lamp inside the carriage. His own outline appeared and faded, appearing again when the light caught the curve of his face or the edge of his collar. The corridor remained attentive. It carried no urgency, no expectation. It existed simply to connect spaces, to allow passage when needed, and to remain unnoticed the rest of the time. The train rocked softly, not enough to wake anyone, only enough to remind those who were listening that movement continued. The sensation traveled through the floor and into the seats, absorbed and returned as calm. Edmund felt his thoughts slow further. They did not complete themselves now. They began and then drifted away, content to leave their endings unformed. The corridor fell quiet again. No more footsteps followed. No doors opened. The train, its passengers, and the night reached an understanding, to share the remaining hours without disturbance. Edmund remained seated, supported by the steady structure of the carriage, accompanied not by conversation, but by the gentle assurance that he was not alone, even as everything around him grew increasingly still. The rain arrived without announcement. At first it was barely there, a fine tapping against the glass that could easily be mistaken for imagination. A soft, irregular sound, lighter than the rhythm of the rails, settling gently into the spaces between them. Then it grew steadier, not heavier, but more certain. Droplets traced slow paths down the window, catching the amber glow of the lamps before slipping away into darkness. Each line formed, lingered, and vanished, replaced by another following much the same course. The roof answered in kind. A muted patter spread along the length of the carriage, softened by layers of metal and age. The sound wrapped itself around the interior, filling it without crowding, like a blanket placed carefully rather than thrown. Edmund noticed the change without opening his eyes. The rain altered the quality of the night. It rounded the edges of sound, smoothing what little sharpness remained. The rails continued beneath it all, their steady cadence now accompanied by this quieter, more fluid rhythm. Tack, dum, tack, dum. Tap, tap, tap. The patterns overlapped without competing. Outside, the countryside disappeared entirely. Fields, hedges, and trees dissolved into a single moving shadow, indistinct and unbroken. The world beyond the glass no longer offered details, only motion. Inside, the carriage grew warmer. The lamps seemed softer now, their light reflected gently by the rain-streaked windows. Shadows blended together, losing their boundaries. Even the corners of the carriage felt less defined, as though the rain had loosened them. A faint scent of dampness found its way inside. It mixed with coal smoke and polished wood, creating a smell that belonged uniquely to long journeys taken at night. It carried no urgency, no association beyond the simple fact of being present. Edmund's breathing slowed further. Each breath arrived easily, left without effort. His shoulders sank a fraction more into the seat, the fabric yielding just enough to support him without asking anything in return. Somewhere along the train, a window was adjusted. The sound was distant and brief, a soft click, followed by silence. The rain continued, unbothered, consistent. Time blurred. Moments stretched and folded into one another, their order becoming less important than their feeling. The journey progressed, but the sense of moving through it began to soften. The rain showed no sign of stopping, nor did it need to. It had found its place alongside the train, content to travel the same distance at the same unhurried pace, accompanying those inside as they drifted deeper into the quiet of the night. The tunnel announced itself before it appeared. The rain changed first. Its sound shifted from a soft, open patter into something closer, more contained. Droplets no longer scattered freely into the night air but struck metal and stone with a rounded, echoing hush. The roof answered with a deeper tone, as though the train had entered a space that listened as much as it enclosed. Then the darkness thickened. Not all at once. The countryside did not vanish, it withdrew. The last suggestion of open land faded, replaced by a darkness that felt nearer, closer to the glass, nearer to the carriage itself. The tunnel received the train. Stone walls slid past the windows, unseen yet strongly felt. The sense of forward motion grew smoother, steadier, as though the train had been guided into a single, continuous line. Inside the carriage, the lamps appeared warmer. Their amber light held firm against the surrounding dark, reflecting softly off polished wood and brass. The windows no longer offered distance. They returned only the quiet interior, layered faintly with shadow. Edmund became aware of a subtle pressure. Not discomfort, simply the awareness of being held within something larger. The tunnel did not rush the train. It allowed passage at the same calm pace, stretching its length to meet the unhurried rhythm of the night. The sound changed again. The rails echoed now, their steady cadence rounding and returning to itself. Tack, dum, tack, dum. Each beat lingered a fraction longer, folding gently into the next. The pattern became almost circular, less like progress and more like continuation. Edmund's thoughts slowed to their quietest form. They arrived without images, without words. They existed only as a sense of ease, a drifting awareness that did not require direction. The carriage swayed slightly. The motion felt different here, smoother, cushioned by stone and distance. The train seemed to float forward rather than roll, carried by its own momentum through the enclosed dark. No one moved. No footsteps sounded in the corridor. No doors opened. The few passengers within the carriage rested as though the tunnel had asked for silence and received it without resistance. Time loosened further. Inside the tunnel, it no longer felt measured. Minutes did not pass. They softened. The journey became a continuous present, unbroken and undemanding. Edmund's breathing was slow and deep now. Each breath followed the last without intention, guided by the steady reassurance of the train beneath him and the warm, contained glow around him. The tunnel continued. Not endlessly, but long enough for its presence to become familiar. Long enough for the outside world to feel distant, abstract, unnecessary. Then, gradually, almost politely, the darkness began to thin. A suggestion of openness returned ahead. Not yet light, but space. The sound of the rain shifted once more, loosening as the stone walls eased away. The train moved on, leaving the tunnel behind it. But the stillness it had created remained, carried forward into the night, settled gently among the passengers like something meant to last. The night beyond the tunnel felt wider. Not brighter, not clearer, simply more open, as though the world had exhaled after holding its breath. The rain returned to its softer rhythm, spreading itself thinly across the roof and windows, no longer confined by stone. The train resumed its steady conversation with the rails. Tack, dum, tack, dum. The sound was unchanged, yet it felt different now. Less directional, less concerned with forward motion. It existed almost as a background to stillness rather than a signal of travel. Edmund remained seated, his posture unchanged. But something within him had shifted. The sense of time, once measured by stations passed and distances covered, had loosened its hold. Moments no longer lined themselves neatly behind one another. They overlapped, softened at the edges, blending into a continuous stretch of calm awareness. Outside, the countryside moved without insisting on form. Occasionally, the suggestion of a tree line appeared, darker against the dark. Sometimes a fence emerged briefly, its posts ticking past in a slow, even count before disappearing again. These sights arrived gently and left without ceremony. Inside the carriage, the lamps held steady. Their amber light no longer felt like illumination so much as presence. It rested on surfaces rather than revealing them, warming the air and deepening the quiet. A distant sound traveled along the train. Not a voice, not quite movement. Perhaps a door closing somewhere far ahead. Perhaps only the imagination giving shape to silence. It passed without interruption, absorbed into the low, constant rhythm of the journey. Edmund's breathing was slow and unremarkable. Each breath followed the last without thought, without adjustment. His chest rose and fell in time with nothing in particular, guided by a comfort that required no explanation. The carriage felt suspended. Though the train continued forward, the interior seemed to float within the night, detached from destinations and schedules. There was no sense of nearing or leaving, only of being carried. Time softened further. The idea of minutes became abstract. The difference between now and a short while ago lost its clarity. The journey unfolded as a single, extended moment, gently shifting but never breaking. Edmund's thoughts thinned. They no longer formed complete impressions. Instead, they appeared as faint sensations: the warmth of the seat, the muted glow of the lamps, the reassurance of the train's steady motion. Each sensation arrived fully formed and then faded, replaced by another. Outside, the rain eased, not stopping entirely, but loosening its grip. The tapping grew more spaced, more intermittent, until it blended seamlessly with the sound of the rails once again. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The sound was faint, carried briefly through the night before slipping away. It did not linger, did not demand response. It simply existed, then passed. The train did not acknowledge it. Nor did Edmund. The carriage remained enclosed in its calm agreement with the night. To move without haste, to sound without disturbance, and to allow those within it to rest in the quiet between thoughts. Edmund's eyes may have closed. If they did, it happened without decision. The world did not change. The warmth, the motion, the sound continued as they had before, indifferent to whether they were observed. Time continued to soften. The journey continued to unfold. And the night, wide and patient, carried the train onward without marking how long it had been doing so. The change was so gentle it might have gone unnoticed. The train did not slow in any dramatic way. There was no sudden shift, no clear signal that something was about to conclude. Instead, the motion altered almost imperceptibly, as though the night itself had begun to guide the journey toward a quieter shape. The rails sounded softer now. Not slower, simply less insistent. The familiar rhythm remained, but its edges were rounded, its presence less defined. Tack, dum, tack, dum. The sound blended easily with the stillness, becoming part of it rather than moving through it. Outside the window, the darkness grew less uniform. Subtle variations appeared. A hedge line here, the pale suggestion of gravel there. The countryside did not announce itself. It allowed itself to be noticed only if one happened to be looking. Edmund remained seated. If his eyes were open, they rested without focus. If they were closed, the world continued exactly as before. The train did not require attention in order to carry him forward. A distant lamp appeared, then another. They were not bright. They did not approach quickly. They simply existed ahead, steady and patient, as though they had been waiting without any sense of urgency. The carriage stayed quiet. No one rose from their seat. No bags were gathered. The corridor remained empty, content to remain so. The night had not yet decided to end, and the train respected that decision. The air felt settled. Warmth lingered in the fabric of the seats, in the wood of the walls, in the low glow of the lamps that had not changed all night. Nothing signaled completion. Nothing suggested departure from this calm. The train eased onward. The lamps outside drew a little closer together now, forming a loose line rather than isolated points. Somewhere beyond the glass, a station may have existed, or perhaps only the suggestion of one. The difference no longer mattered. Edmund did not prepare to move. There was no need. Arrival, when it came, would not require action. It would not ask him to wake, or to stand, or to remember how long the journey had been. It would arrive in the same way the night had unfolded, quietly, without demand. The rails continued the gentle conversation. The carriage continued to sway. The lamps continued to glow. Time did not stop. It simply loosened its hold a little more. And the train, unhurried and certain, carried its passengers onward into whatever waited next, not as a destination to be reached, but as a continuation of the calm that had accompanied them all through the night. The night remained. The motion remained. And rest, having found its place, did not feel the need to leave.